Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews. I am super caffeinated this morning. The coffee is coffeeing, and I have a lot to say about this book today. Also, happy Halloween. I hope you guys have a good Halloween, and I'm probably just gonna spend it sort of low-key, hang out with family, watch some spooky movies, and pass out candy, but I love this time of year, love the fall, and love this holiday. So today we're going to be discussing the Double Jinx Mystery. This is the 50th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it came out in 1973. And I don't know, when you look at this book cover, you can kind of tell that it came out in the 70s. You can see Nancy's collared shirt, and there's a bird on the cover. This book, it deals a lot with birds and taxidermy birds, and I don't know, it just reminds me of that estate sale that you've probably been to, where it's like the rooms are all wood paneling in the house, there's taxidermy everywhere. Is it just me? Am I the only one that's been to an estate sale like this? If you haven't ever been to an estate sale like that, you need to make it your goal to at least go to one in your lifetime. It's an experience. So if you'd like to see these book covers that I discuss on the front end of the podcast, I always post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. So we have two book covers to discuss today, and they're very similar. I think the second edition is probably from the UK. And in the first book cover, we have Nancy and Ned, and there's a bird, and it's sitting on Nancy's head, and it's got its beak. It's like it's pecking at Ned's head. It looks really weird. It's like it's trying to make a nest out of his hair. I don't know. But Nancy's got the collared shirt. It's a very dark cover, and it's one of the weirder ones. And in the second edition of this cover, I like this one a little bit better because the bird is giving Nancy and Ned some more personal space. It's not right on top of their head. It's actually sitting on a branch. Nancy has more red hair in this cover, and it looks more cartoony looking. I don't know. I've had a parrot like sit on my shoulder before, but like a bird on top of your head, like I just imagine that being a really just disgusting mess if that bird has to go to the bathroom. Oh no, wait, we actually have 3 book covers to discuss today. This is another edition that's from another country, but this one is too weird not to talk about. So this book cover actually totes this mystery as being number 38, which is interesting because it was number 50 in America. It's weird how they release the books in different countries in different orders. I don't know, that seems kind of like it would be weird to read them that way. I mean, you can read them out of order. It's not a big deal. But in this book cover, we have this guy, and this is actually Merv Marvel. He's like a circus performer, I think, but he's got Nancy in this very awkward hold. Like, she's got her legs around his waist. Like, honestly, this looks really inappropriate. And he's got his hand over Nancy's mouth, and she's trying to signal to somebody. This must be when he kidnaps her in the book. This is a scene in the book, but this is such a weird book cover. So I came up with a couple funny cover spoofs for the first 2 versions of this book cover, and the first one is Nancy Drew and the Mystery of the Bird's Nest in Ned's Hair, because it's just so weird. And then the second funny cover spoof that I came up with is just taxidermy terrors, because I don't know, like I know taxidermy is a bit of an art for the people that do it, but I've seen some on Google that are like fails, and they're horrifying to look at. I don't know, I'm personally not a fan of it, but I'm calling it now. I think that this is the most 70s cover art that we get on a Nancy Drew book, at least that I've seen up to this point. But as far as giving these book covers a rating, I would say 2.5 to 3 magnifying glasses. Like, they're interesting and kind of spooky, but they're not my favorite. And then that third book cover, I don't even know. It's so weird looking. So now I'll go ahead and list some of the characters in the Double Jinx Mystery. So there is Oscar Thurston, and he is the owner of an aviary, which is the main focus of this mystery. And his wife, Martha, is at this aviary with them. She has a lot of superstitions, and I believe she has some health issues too that kind of play into this book. There's also a man named Roush, who is Oscar's employee. There is Kaminka, who she is a university student, like a foreign exchange student, and she's staying with the Thurstons. There is Ramsey Wright, who is the owner of these high-rise apartments, which we'll get back to that in a second. Mervyn Gantry, or Merv Marvel, he's the one that was in that third book cover and is like an ex-circus performer. Chief Pepper, who is a policeman at the Harper Police Department, and Clyde O'Malley, aka Slick Fingers. So now I'll go ahead and read a quick synopsis for the Double Jinx Mystery. Nancy tells Bess and George that her dad has taken a man named Oscar Thurston's case. He has been receiving threats, and Carson believes it's because he won't sell his property and bird aviary to a company that wants to build apartments. Strange jinxes keep happening, including a stuffed bird being left in the Drews' yard, explosions, and birds being poisoned. Nancy and Ned also catch the bird flu, some guy named Slick Fingers continues to evade them, and Nancy and Ned go over a dam. Nancy also gets kidnapped by a leaping man who tries to induct her into a cult. And finally, this mystery ends with Nancy catching the bad guys, and the aviary and apartment complex can exist in harmony. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with to sum the whole story up is crooks of a feather flock together. Nancy Drew solves another crime, aviary to stay. So let's jump into some of the direct quotes and notes that I took down for the Double Jinx Mystery. So the first thing that I wrote down is we're solving some jinxes in this mystery. Cool. I really didn't know what to expect going into this book. I was like, well, as a kid, we would do that thing on the playground. It would be like, Jinx, you owe me a soda, that type of thing. So I was like, jinxes, hijinxes, pranks, curses, like that to me suggests more of a human nature rather than a haunting where people are like, we're just calling it a haunting because we have no explanation for this. And a jinx seems more like this is something that a person has done to another person. So the construction company that is wanting to build these high-rise apartments where the aviary is called High Rise Construction Company. And I was like, oh wow, what a catchy name. Like, it's not necessary to have a cool name for your business, but it goes a long way. It'd be like somebody selling ice cream and their business name is just Ice Cream Company. It's just so generic and very boring. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy hears the doorbell ring, and when she opens it, there's a wry-neck woodpecker just sitting on the lawn. But it's not just any woodpecker, it's a stuffed taxidermy one, so it obviously didn't get there by itself. And Hannah knows the type of bird that it is. She takes one look at it and she's like, yeah, that's a wry-neck woodpecker. And I said, a woman after Red Knot's heart. Red Knot, of course, being the guy who loves to bird watch in the game Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake. Like, him and Hannah may get along. Like, I feel like this needs to be fan fiction or something. Hannah Gruen and Red Knot, their budding romance. They probably wouldn't have much else in common, though. So Nancy and Hannah are just looking at this taxidermy woodpecker, and then Nancy all of a sudden just jumps to the conclusion that there's a bomb in it, and so she's like, there may be a bomb in the bird. And Hannah says that particular bird was unlucky and used to hex people. But the real question is, who gave Nancy the bird? Who gave Nancy the bird? But I don't know. It was such a weird conclusion for Nancy to make, to just be like, there's this taxidermy bird in my yard. It must have a bomb in it. Like, usually Nancy doesn't do that. She will hear a ticking noise or something to indicate that there is a bomb, but there's no mentioning of ticking or anything at all. But they take it to the police, and the police are like, no, this is just a stuffed bird. So next, Nancy, Bess, and George go to the aviary, and they see this man cutting the cages and trying to let the birds out. So they chase him, and he gets away. And it's after this happens that they meet Oscar, the guy who owns the aviary, and he says a university student is staying with him and his wife and brought a pet wry-neck. So Nancy, of course, is like, this is the same bird, stuffed bird, that appeared on my lawn. Maybe there's a connection. But the university student's name is Kaminka, and she has this pet bird, and I think its name is Petra. So the name of the bird is Petra, and Kaminka just brought it with her overseas, I guess, but Nancy knows, like, well, she's staying with these people at this aviary. She would know a lot about birds. She's like suspect number one right now. Now, it's right after this that we get to meet Miss Thurston, Oscar's wife, and she's just described as an invalid, and she's very superstitious about certain birds, which seems a little weird to me. I'm like, you married this guy who's really into birds, and you have all these superstitions regarding birds. It's a little bit of a... doesn't seem like the best relationship for you, maybe. But she says Cammy, or Kaminka, is psychic, and Bess also asks about wry-neck birds and bad luck, and Cammy gets offended about it and goes upstairs. I mean, it seems a little bit weird to get offended about saying that an animal is, linked to bad luck or superstitions. And honestly, that's not the question I think Bess should have been asking. I would have been like, what do you mean she's psychic? I think Nancy asks Miss Thurston to kind of expand on that. Like, what do you mean Cammy is psychic? And Miss Thurston just says, well, she just says bad things are going to happen, and then they do. And I was like, that just sounds a lot like somebody who's sabotaging. Like, maybe to someone who's very superstitious, it would look like, oh, this person's just psychic. But if anyone were to draw the logical conclusion, they would be like, well, isn't it interesting that this person says that bad things are going to happen, and then those bad things happen? Like, what are the odds? What a coincidence. So Nancy, Bess, and George leave the aviary, and Nancy goes to the store, and she gets hit on the ankle by a rogue shopping cart. And when she gets home, Miss Thurston calls her in a frenzy, and she says, Cammy has ESP and had a vibration that Nancy was going to get hurt. If I were Nancy Drew, though, I probably would have asked Miss Thurston, well, did Cammy see this imminent danger happening to me at the Piggly Wiggly, or was she just really vague about it? I think Miss Thurston just sees superstitions everywhere, and Cammy, she probably could have drawn the conclusion that something bad is going to happen to Nancy, because she's this exchange student, Cammy is, and she's been at the aviary long enough to see all these bad things happening, and it would be logical to draw the conclusion, well, Nancy's getting involved in trying to solve this case, bad things are probably going to happen to her too. So it's at this point in the mystery when Nancy takes the stuffed bird back to Harper University. Carson actually found out that that's where it came from. It was stolen from the university. And coincidentally, that's where Cammy goes to school. And after talking to a professor, Nancy finds out that Cammy borrowed a key that opened the case where the bird was. Suspicious. So it was when I was at this part of the book that I really was starting to suspect Cammy of all these accidents at the aviary. It was just like, well, they started happening right after she showed up. But it turns out that it's really a lot of distraction, and we really need to start paying attention to this high-rise apartment company. So next, Nancy goes to Thurston's aviary, and she finds Cammy talking to the guy who tried to let the birds out. So this was, again, very suspicious, but she also sees some fresh dug earth and throws a rock at it, and there's an explosion. So someone buried a landmine near the aviary. This doesn't really sound like something that a college student would do. This sounds like somebody with money and something to lose would do. They would be putting landmines out and trying to just cause destruction for this aviary. But Nancy talks to Cammy and she says, why were you talking to that guy? Do you know him? And she says, no, I was just out here for a walk and he just happened along and I didn't realize that he was the guy who tried to let the birds out. So Nancy reports this explosion to the chief of police in the town of Harper, and his name is Chief Pepper, and I could not stop thinking about Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Just call me Pepper. Sergeant Pepper. So the chief says that he'll look into the explosion, and he asks Nancy to give him a description of the guy that was seen talking to Cammy, the one who tried to let the birds out. And so Nancy's like, oh, I can do you one better. I'll sketch him. And I remembered, like, she did this in another book where she was just sketching people. Oh, I cannot remember which one it was, but she sketches this guy, and Sergeant Pepper, Chief Pepper, looks him up in his database, and he's like, oh, this is Clyde O'Malley, aka Slick Fingers. Which Slick Fingers, what a weird name. I guess he's a pickpocket and he steals things. But yeah, so Nancy's like, okay, well now I have a name to go with this guy's appearance. Oh, and it was Quest of the Missing Map. I'm pretty sure that was the book where Nancy was doing all her artist type skills. So next, Nancy and Ned go to meet one of the councilmen who's being bribed to approve the apartments. So there's 5 separate councilmen that have been approached about developing this high-rise apartments, and which that is super corrupt, by the way. Like, the fact that this high-rise apartment complex entity is trying to bribe these councilmen to get what they want, which is this property. But anyway, they go to this guy, his name is Mr. Hinchcliffe, and he asks when Nancy and Ned are getting married, and Ned looks down and Nancy blushes. So I thought it was kind of funny that they both avoided answering the question, but he was asking them because he thought they wanted to rent an apartment from him. So Nancy and Ned leave from talking to him, and they go to clean the bird cages at the aviary, and they admit it's harder than selling insurance and solving mysteries. And I, as the full-time pet sitter who have watched turkeys and have mucked farm stalls, have to agree. Birds can be really messy. So after Nancy does that, she goes to talk to Miss Thurston, who says she saw a specter who drew a jinx sign on a piece of paper. And so her husband Oscar is trying to calm her down, and he and Ned go to check on the birds while Nancy makes dinner. And Nancy calls Hannah at this point for some advice because Hannah is one of the best cooks ever. And so Hannah's advice is just not to make anything French and keep it simple. I thought it was so sweet that Nancy asked Hannah for advice on cooking. But it's while Nancy's in there cooking, she starts to get worried when Ned and Oscar don't come back after a while. So she goes looking for them, and she finds they've been chloroformed and all the sick birds are now dead. So this is a huge loss for the aviary. And of course, Oscar is upset once Nancy wakes him up, and she wakes Ned up, and they go inside and they're able to eat dinner. But it's kind of messed up that somebody would kill these birds just to get these apartments built on this land. Like, it's ugh. So Nancy and Ned decide to go to this ballet. Nancy's trying to find a man who can leap really far, since Miss Thurston said that's what the specter did. She said he left the hex sign and then he leaped across the room. So of course Nancy's like, well, who else can leap across a room? Ballerinas. So Nancy talks to Mr. Van Camp, who's the director of the ballet, and he says he let a man go who could leap very far. He was unprofessional, that's why he got fired, and his name was Merv Marvel. Then there's this whole scene where Nancy learns how to leap from this guy named Boris, one of the ballet dancers, and then he hugs and kisses her, but the book says she'd prefer Ned as a partner. I don't know, I think personally he shouldn't have been so handsy with her, but it's funny too because everyone is of course like, oh, Nancy, you're a natural at this, you should be a ballerina. But Nancy leaves with Ned, and she says he's very quiet, and so she thinks that he's jealous about her dancing with this guy named Boris. But it turns out that Ned is sick and he has ornithosis, or bird flu. So Ned wakes up with a horrible fever, and Ned's parents are away in Europe, so he's staying with the Drews, and they call a doctor, and the doctor says he needs rest, he needs to be quarantined, and so that's what they do. So Nancy lets Ned rest, and she goes with Bess and George to help at the Thurston's aviary again, which, I don't know, I think if Ned caught the bird flu from the aviary, I don't think I would be so quick to go back there. I mean, you definitely need to wear the appropriate gear to be working with animals like that, like especially if they're sick. But anyway, they just go and they clean out more cages. But after this, they go to see Councilman Ryan, who, this guy's a complete jerk, and it's a waste of their time. So Nancy's kind of aggravated, and she goes back home, and Hannah says Ned has been calling for her. Ned's delirious and he has a fever, but what he says actually makes a lot of sense. He says, well, I've got the bird flu, so this Slick Fingers guy, Clyde O'Malley, probably has the bird flu too. So Nancy starts searching hospitals for him, and one nurse asks if she's looking for a special friend. I love how whenever Nancy is looking for criminals, people assume she's looking for a date. So it's while Nancy's at the hospital that she runs into an old classmate, Evelyn, who is a nurse, and she says Clyde O'Malley came into her clinic. And she also says she thought Nancy would be a professional dancer, not a detective. I thought this was just a weird, random aside. But Nancy thanks Evelyn for the information, and as she's leaving the hospital, she runs into Roush, Oscar's assistant, who says Cammie's bird Petra has gone missing. So Nancy knows that Cammie is probably devastated about this because her pet bird is like her best friend, but she starts to feel sick when she's leaving the hospital, so she goes home, and it turns out that she has the bird flu also. So Nancy's put on bed rest now, and Bess and George have to go talk to Councilman Winery on Nancy's behalf, and he says if Nancy can draw up a plan that includes the amount of apartments approved and the aviary, he'll talk to the other councilmen. So Nancy came up with this counter idea, like the aviary doesn't have to go anywhere. You can still have the aviary on this part of the property and the apartments over here. So she's kind of starting to win over some of the councilmen. But it's while Bess and George are talking to this councilman that George notices someone was listening at the door, but she can't see who it is. And as they're leaving, Gus, an assistant of Mr. Winery, says, "Oh, I'll show you the newspaper printing presses and how they work." But then Bess and George get ink and glue thrown at them by Spike Hinchcliffe, the son of one of the other council members, who was really rude to Nancy. So Spike was put up to this by his dad, and this ends up backfiring on them in a big way. So the other council members that were more on the side of the Hinchcliffes now start to be more on Nancy's side. Now, it's at this point in the mystery when Nancy is starting to feel a little better. She's kind of starting to get over the bird flu. So she, Bess, and George go on a picnic, and they see Cammie's lost bird, Petra, up in this tree. So, of course, what does Nancy decide to do? She's just gotten over the bird flu. She's not even back to her full strength yet, but she's like, yeah, I'm going to go climb this tree. And so she almost falls out of the tree trying to get Petra. So they decide to bring Cammie back, and she's able to catch Petra. And the next note that I wrote down is Ned gets a jinx, Cammie gets a jinx, everyone gets a jinx. Like, everybody keeps getting these little pieces of paper and notes with jinxes on them, but Cammie finds a ring, and it's a family heirloom of hers, and it's in a package under Petra's wing when she catches the bird again. But instead of being completely happy about, getting this heirloom back, she's kind of freaked out about it because she knows that somebody stole it from her and then they gave it back to her, which that would be really weird. That would be such an invasion of privacy to know that somebody stole something from you and then they gave it back. It's like them saying, I can take something from you whenever I want and then I can give it back to you. It's such a weird power move on the villain's part. So this next note is really funny, but Nancy, Bess, and George take this gaggle of 9 children to the aviary, but not before they get stopped by the police. So Nancy loads all these kids into her convertible, and she gets stopped by the police, naturally, because there's not enough seats in the car and not enough seat belts. And Nancy says, I wasn't speeding. And the officer is like, you have 12 people in a convertible that rides 6. So Nancy sweet talks him and he lets them go, but only if they promise to take 2 cars back home. So these kids they belong to these grandparents who own part of the property that's going to be sold for this apartment development. But that's why Nancy's taking them to the aviary. She's like, oh, I'll convince the kids that this is so cool. And then they'll go back to their grandparents and they'll say, please don't destroy the aviary. So she has a motive for doing this. But one of the kids named Jimmy gets attacked by a raven. And, he gets scratched up pretty bad, but he's okay. The next note that I have down is Nancy and Ned get pushed over a dam while trying to visit Ramsey Wright at a housing development. So this is the guy who's trying to develop the apartments. He has all these other housing developments around town. And the culprit who pushed them over is named Nat Banner, but he denies it. He says, no, I didn't push you over the dam. But Nancy tricks them both by asking them to help her find who pushed them. She's just basically like, well, okay, if you didn't push me over the dam, help me find who did. So they're going around kind of aimlessly searching, and when the group and a cop go back to the dam, Nancy points out these huge footprints that match Banner's, and she's like, look, these footprints are the same size as this guy's foot. So the cop arrests Banner, and he's like, come on, you're coming with me. The next note that I took down is Miss Thurston says she knew the girls were coming because she saw it in her tea leaves. So Nancy, Bess, and George show up, and Miss Thurston's like, oh, I saw it in the tea leaves that you were coming today. And she also says that Roush walked out a window. And I thought this was hilarious because she says, one should never step out of a window. It's bad luck. And Bess retorts, especially if it's a second floor window. But Nancy goes to talk to Roush, and she finds out that he did this because he saw someone trying to poison the parrots, and the window just happened to be open. So he's like, And so he ran out there real quick to get the people to run away. The next thing to happen in the book is Nancy finds an envelope full of money and rings with a jinx on it. And so she works with the police to set up a sting and catch Slick Fingers. And so everybody's waiting to see if he'll show up to collect the envelope, and then Merv Marvel, the leaping specter guy, grabs Nancy and runs off with her and says, "You little vixen, you may as well stop fighting because you're not going to leave me. I'll teach you to be my dancing partner." This guy is so creepy. So then Nancy says, "Take me back," and Merv says, "No, we're going to dance." So they're out waltzing in the middle of the woods, like 1, 2, cha-cha-cha. So while Nancy and Merv are out dancing, she does get him to admit that Ramsey Wright hired him to sabotage the aviary. And then Merv takes Nancy to this barn, and it's dark, and when the lights come on, there's a bunch of chanting, and he says, "It's the devil dance, let's go in." I don't know that one. Is that like the electric slide? So the cops come and surround the barn, and they catch everybody, and that whole scene was so weird, though. I was like, Nancy's about to get inducted into a cult. And then when Nancy talks to Carson, he says Ramsey Wright is also in charge of the weird cult. It's like it's his side hustle or something, because apparently real estate isn't too hot right now. I guess everybody needs a side hustle. And then in the last page and a half of this book, we get it dumped on us that Cammy is like semi-royalty back from where she comes from, which it's never made clear where she comes from. It's so weird. Okay, so for the What's Cooking segment of the podcast, it looks like we had a couple mentionings of things in this book. There was tea and cookies, split pea soup, broiled lamb chops, mashed potatoes and creamed spinach, chicken broth and fruit salad, and some kind of croquette with spicy sauce. Kind of interesting. And for the add that to your resume section, I said that Nancy could say she's a leaping legend because she got to leap around on the stage with all the ballerinas at the ballet, and she's an architect drafter. She drew out a pretty compelling layout for that apartment complex, like so much so that the people were like, yeah, we want to use your drawings. Now let's discuss the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the Double Jinx Mystery. So I said that this book started out pretty great. I mean, I was kind of curious, why is this stuffed bird on Nancy's lawn? But then it just progressively got worse. I don't know. I feel like we went to the aviary a lot, which, I mean, that's where this mystery centers around. But it got progressively more boring, I think, as the book went along, to me. So, I don't know. I guess that's a thing that I liked and didn't like at the same time. One thing I liked was Nancy goes over a dam. That's a new one. Usually she has boating accidents or crazy things, but she's never been over a dam until this book. And I didn't like Nancy and Ned getting the bird flu. I mean, it put a damper on Nancy solving the mystery a little bit. And I mean, I don't know. It just seemed like an excuse to throw the bird flu into the book as, oh, we're dealing with birds, so of course they have to get the bird flu. And I didn't like all the superstitions in this book. Miss Thurston kind of went a little bit overboard with her superstitions. So as far as a book rating goes, I gave the Double Jinx Mystery a 1 magnifying glass rating. I just didn't think it was a very compelling mystery. I don't know. It had some, I mean, the people had motives, the villains had motives, but the plot was kind of weird. And then Nancy packing all those kids in that car, it was like, Nancy Drew would not do this. Like, she's a rule abider. And I don't know. It's just, there was a lot of things with this book that I was just like, it fell flat for me. So that concludes today's episode. For next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the mystery of the glowing eye. So if you like books where Ned Nickerson gets kidnapped and there's a big glowing cyclops eye, you won't want to miss this one. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.